Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden is laying out his plan to lift communities of color. The former vice president vowing to leverage more than $150 billion in new capital and opportunities for small businesses that he says have been structurally excluded for generations. The Biden plan also includes increasing access to venture capital and low interest business loans. Our next guest is calling for a bold plan to address the racial wealth gap, specifically calling for $14 trillion in reparations. I want to bring in Robert Johnson. He is the BET co-founder and entrepreneur. And Bob, it's great to have you on. I want to just get your reaction to these headlines coming out from the Biden campaign today. Not sure if you've had a chance to actually look at the plan, but the headline here being $150 billion in new capital and opportunities for small businesses. This is something that you've talked about before as well. How far do you think that goes in moving the needle to address the broader income divide that exists right now?
Kiko, thanks. First of all, I think I want everybody to know that a recent article in Axios pointed out what it called 10 myths about efforts to close the wealth gap. And it pointed out that none of those proposals, programs, or behavior patterns on the part of African Americans, taken individually or together, will not close the wealth gap between Black and white Americans. And the income gap, forget the wealth for the moment, two different things. The income gap is 10 times that spread. $170,000 median wealth for white families, $17,000 median income wealth for Black families. So I will admit I haven't read the vice president's proposal, but based on the Axios article, backed up by really nonpartisan facts from highly recognized and competent institutions, clearly point out that programs like $150 billion in investments in lending to small businesses simply do not work and will not close the wealth gap. And so, as much as I appreciate what the vice president is trying to do, it is too little and probably way, way too late.
So what needs to change in how we address this issue?
Well, Akiko, you understand it from a business standpoint. The way you get wealth is to have wealth from the beginning. So you can invest it, you can create economic growth from having your wealth assets work for you while you're not, if you will, not working. And that has been the reason for what Axios called not just a gap, a chasm in wealth between Blacks and whites. So the only way I see that, if these programs are not working, it pointed out that if Black Americans got together and the businesses and put all of their money, their revenue, about $103 billion over 10 years into Black banks, those Black banks would have less than 1/4 of what JP Morgan Chase has in its bank on any given moment. They pointed out that education doesn't yield the wealth, the parity. They pointed out the housing. All of these programs have been tried before. So to me, the way to get wealth in the hands of the Black community is to transfer the wealth that was taken from Black people and people, the 40 million people who are alive today after slavery and racism and Jim Crowism, is reparations. And that's why I propose a $14 trillion reparations plan over 30 years. And if you do the math and break it down, because that's the way it would have to be done from a tax standpoint, it would amount to about $8 a day per tax-paying white American over 30 years. They'll give you $14 trillion. That money would go to 40 million descendants of African Americans to let them deploy that capital as everybody else does in ways that create wealth.
So that the $14 trillion is something that you have put forward, or you put forward several months ago. I'm curious if you've gotten lawmakers reaching out to you, if you've gotten support on this plan. I guess a broader question here is, who would actually pay for it?
Well, to the second question, who would actually pay? Every white American who's a taxpayer in the United States. That one's pretty simple. as to have I gotten any feedback, the answer is most elected officials tend to believe in what I call government programs, subsidies, and means-tested programs to help Black Americans. So no one is willing to put cash into the pockets of Black Americans. They will come out with subsidized housing. They will come up with welfare programs. They will come up with programs involving children's benefits and programs like that. That's not wealth. Wealth does not come from subsidies. Wealth begets wealth. So if you have access to capital and you're a family and you can pool your capital like many families do, that's your movement towards wealth. The slaves who were in this country, brought here against their will, transferred their labor to white slave owners, which filtered throughout the U.S. economy. And the one thing I know, slaves may die, even their grandchildren may die. What doesn't die, and Akiko, you know this, is money. Money not only doesn't die, it circulates and it multiplies. And if you gave me 100 of the best accountants from Pricewaterhouse, forensic accountants, I guarantee you I could trace about 80% of the wealth of this country back to slavery. So how does anyone expect to close that wealth gap with $150 billion? Now, you can make some people better off, but that's not closing the wealth gap. So if Vice President Biden's program says, I want to make a few Black people better off, he can probably achieve that. But if he wants to close the wealth gap and repay for slavery and attending over 30, 40 years systemic racism, $150 billion ain't going to do it.
Bob, it's always good to talk to you. I'd love to get you back on the show to continue this conversation as we continue to track what has come from these nationwide demonstrations and the broader conversation about racial income inequality. Bob Johnson, the BET as co-founder and entrepreneur. Thanks so much for your time today.